Alright, hello and welcome to the final of these podcasts that we started about 4 years ago. So, The Wire, Season 5.
Is that the one we're going to start with then?
Go on then.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Wire, Season 5 came out, I don't even know when, I need to get up on my phone, 2007 maybe? It's when it ended. And it's, it's not as good as the other seasons.
I think it's probably the least good, actually, of all 5 seasons. I think when we talked about this some time ago, there was probably a conversation to be had around Season 2 and Season 5, which is the most inconsistent, which is the poorer. But I think you've got to have some love for Season 2 when other people don't. I think this season, it derails so much from what made the original core concept of the show compelling, doesn't it?
Well, I do kind of like it though.
You like the silliness.
Yeah. Well, look, I think like every season of The Wire, there are loads of different plot strands that kind of come together and culminate in the end. And I think when you look at them, there are some that work better than others. So I think when you're looking at the Marlowe stuff and the Michaels, working with Marlowe, that element of the plot, that's as good as The Wire has ever been. I mean, it's on Season 3, Season 4 level.
Mm.
I think that the serial killer stuff is obviously the controversial bit that's very silly and completely unrealistic. And there's obviously it's funny, but it's the worst part of the show. And then I think in between that, you've kind of got certain other elements. Like you've got the newspaper, which some people love, some people hate. I think it's actually, okay. Obviously, the problem is how it links in with the serial killer stuff, which is unrealistic. But I quite like some of the characters that get introduced in that plot thread.
Yeah, you mentioned the whole newspaper stuff. I really like it because I think that very much is The Wire. When you think about what separates each season and makes it distinct from one another, it's all about how it tackles different institutions, different, I guess, systems that are in Baltimore. So you've got the dockyards in Season 2. In Season 4, you have the education system. And then in Season 5, the really novel part of it all is this newspaper branch. I can't remember what the paper is. It's probably called the Baltimore Globe or the Baltimore Post or something like that. Yeah. And you follow, I think from what I remember, it's predominantly 2 journalists. One that's very good and is definitely the mouthpiece for the writer of the show. And the other one that's not afraid to bend the rules and twist the truth a little bit to support his narrative.
Was he called Gus, the good one?
Yeah, so Gus is the good one.
And Scott Templeton is the bad one.
Yeah, and Scott Templeton, he's played by an actor who's gone on to direct other things,
yeah,
I think,
he
right?
directed Spotlight.
Spotlight, yeah.
But, so, I know that plotline kind of gets a lot of shit. I think it was because a lot of TV critics who were journalists suddenly were like, hang on, this isn't a very realistic depiction of what it's like to be a journalist. So it gets a lot of shit for that. I think in terms of the other plot threads, some of the political stuff with Carcetti and like them finally trying to nail Clay Davis, I think was really good. And then the Omar stuff was very inconsistent. Very, again, unrealistic, very sort of Hollywood. Although I like how his that storyline concludes.
I like how it concludes as well. I think what I could imagine people disliking about Omar in Season 5, and you can tell me if you agree with this or not, is that in a similar tone of the serial killer stuff, which we'll get onto in more detail a bit later on, it's that there are some kind of unbelievable and, I guess, outside of realism stuff that happens with Omar in that final season. It becomes a bit too action-packed. It becomes a bit too blockbustery. But I kind of don't like that because the scenes that I remember, and again, you're testing me a little bit here, I remember scenes of him jumping out of a window and surviving and things like that, and he kind of ends up becoming the sort of mythical cult hero that he's basically built himself up to be, that he can do these unbelievable things.
Yeah, so in terms of the Omar stuff, the jumping out the window is sort of something I was alluding to when talking about how realistic the whole thing is. And I think that actually did happen to the guy it's based on. He did jump out of a window that was a similar height. But it does read as like a very unrealistic element. I think we talked before about how The Wire is a very grounded show, but there are stylized elements. And like characters like Brother Muzone and Omar were those kind of stylized elements. And it does take it maybe a step too far in the 5th season. Although the way he, dies, kind of coming out of nowhere and being like very shocking, and kind of pulls you back to that sort of more grounded, like Wire type atmosphere, something like happening that's kind of unexpected, but it makes complete sense.
Yeah, you could sort of feel that Omar was living on borrowed time in a sense. Like as a member of the audience watching the show, you can see what it's going towards, but it is just that subtle reminder that I guess when you play the game or you're in Baltimore, in that area of Baltimore that's so crime riddled that really anything can happen to you at any time. And I remember when I was watching this episode, I was kind of taken aback because we were watching it in the same room together, and our housemate at the time, he was doing all kinds of stuff in front of me, and I was kind of trying to keep my focus on watching the show and watching him at the same time, and all of a sudden it was just like, wait, has Omar just died? Get out of the way so I can see.
It's a classic moment.
It is, yeah, it is. I was going to say that I think part of the what basically happens with Omar, the stuff you were talking about a minute ago, it is an embodiment of and Brother Muzone as well. It is an embodiment of something stylized about the show. The fact that they can keep that stuff to a minimum pretty much the whole way throughout is part of what attracts you to it in the first place. When you think of all the great TV shows that there have been over the last 20, 25 years that HBO have put out or AMC have put out, there's certain characters and storylines where you kind of have to suspend your disbelief a little bit, and in doing so you can really commit to these characters that are really, really interesting and I guess unbelievable. I mean, when you think about Breaking Bad, you think of the kind of like someone like Mike, someone that cool, someone that organised, someone that's always in control. He doesn't exist in real life. I don't think people like Gus in the form that they get presented in really exist in real life. Whereas I think back to early seasons of The Wire, and I think of people in, it's Avon Barksdale, isn't it? In Avon's crew, the people that D'Angelo hang out with, and that whole setup, the characters that you see, I can't really think of high-profile shows that I've really ever seen that show things in such a seemingly authentic way, where characters, I guess, aren't. You sacrifice characters being a little bit interesting, but what you get is something really gritty.
Yeah.
In its nature, and season 5 loses that a little bit for me.
Definitely. So I think the greatest strength of The Wire is the kind of key collaboration between the creatives. It was a former cop and it was a former newspaper writer working with novelists as the staff writing team who didn't really do TV, and it gives the whole thing this incredibly grounded, honest, authentic experience, and it fleshes out the characters where they aren't caricatured. And what I think that approach allowed the show to do was tackle these giant themes and these giant structures of American life and inner city life in a very believable way and digestible, and slowly building towards probably season 3 and 4, which I think are the strongest combination. Although when you think about season 3, Amsterdam is quite a ridiculous thing.
That's very true, yeah.
The season 5 framing device it all hangs on just doesn't work with this serial killer, and everyone's hiding behind a lie. And you've got to think at this point, I know I was bringing it up, but he's doing some George W. Bush Iraq War stuff, and that everyone's believing the same lie to benefit. And he's trying to sort of tackle that with the paper, love the serial killer. The McNulty and his gang are getting funded through it, and but it is just such a ridiculous concept for the show that McNulty, coming from his season 4 where he acts like a very reasonable guy, to immediately being a full-on psycho.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about why I just find that to basically be the death of the show in a sense. But you mentioned Amsterdam. It's weird how when you think of Amsterdam now and you're kind of detached from the show because you haven't watched it for a while, it is a bit absurd, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the way it gets presented in the show, you totally buy it. For I don't know if it's the writing, I don't know if it's the way they compose the whole thing, the way they shoot it. There's something about it that you buy into and you believe in the moment, even though if you think outside of the show, actually, with the kind, you couldn't really do that in real life without someone high up knowing about it, because you couldn't conceal it to the level that I think Bunny ends up doing in that show.
Because he's got the real Jay Landsman with him. And I think the way the slow build to it, and you can like see the idea formulating, and it does pull together in a more believable way. Whereas the abrupt McNulty finding the body and then Bunk doing the NPC dialogue, like, oh, Jimmy, as he's
all right, so that is. I've got to give him credit for that. It's one of my favourite scenes in the entire show. I think it's so good.
I think like part of the like really fun bits, like when they like they do like the fake call to like Scott Templeton.
That starts one of the episodes off, doesn't it?
Scott lies about it, and then Jimmy like he does the fake call, and then they like, they sort of like triangulate it. And that stuff's really fun. I think one of the sort of key texts to read the season is quite a throwaway moment, but towards right at the end of the season, Michael comes home. And Dookie and Michael's younger brother are watching Dexter on TV, and Dookie's like, "You gotta watch this. It's a serial killer that hunts other serial killers."
Oh my god! I remember that.
I think that is almost David Simon being like, "How am I supposed to compete with this?" Like, it's culture and like TV and entertainment is getting like so much more outlandish that almost to make his point, he took the show away from the realism it had into being a bit more of a over the top satire. I don't think it worked.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I agree. I don't think it works. I think you lose something when I think about the first season, especially. I know you and I both love season 3 and season 4, and they are probably the pinnacle of the show in terms of quality, in terms of your emotional investment. But I think season 1, what I loved about it the first time I watched it years and years ago, and what I loved about it when I rewatched it a couple of years ago was, in terms of detective shows, you see a group of people build a case from the bottom up.
Yeah.
They have nothing to go on. They don't even have a picture of their suspect until episode 3. I love that, right? I mean, how many detective crime shows do we watch where it's a new case in episode, and the pacing of the episode means that they get all the information that they need at the perfect beats within the episode, and it just all comes together very, very naturally. Whereas in The Wire, it feels like a real grind. It feels like they've got to work incredibly hard to get anything out of it. And then right at the end of the season, from what I remember, the people that deserve to be punished the most get the lightest punishments, and the people that don't deserve to be punished are the ones that they really, really suffer. And that what they had in that first season was kind of storytelling gold in that sense. But in season 5, that whole, I guess, aura, the whole mood around. I'm running out of substitutes for the word realism, the authenticity, the groundedness of it all. You lose that because it all centres on a cop pretend. You know what? I can't even remember the setup of it. Can you remind me how it all starts? Why does Jimmy even do this in the first place?
Because so what happens is at the end of the 4th season, Carcetti is elected and promises that he'll invest in like the police and major crimes, and then he can't. He shuts major crimes down in season 5 because there's a funding issue because of the black hole in the school budget. So to get funding, they create like a crisis about the serial killer killing homeless people, and then like funneling the money from that investigation into Marlowe. I think it is what they do.
That sort of rings a bell.
So it sort of ties the political, like Carcetti's campaigning on, the Mayor Royce or whoever. I think it's Royce. I think it's someone else. But this guy, doesn't care about the homeless. I do. So he's kind of benefiting from that. Obviously, Major Crimes is doing the Marlowe investigation with the funds from the serial killer stuff. And then the newspapers, but like Scott Templeton becomes the story. The serial killer's like after him, and like the Gail from Breaking Bad working in the paper like loves him.
Yeah. Okay. It's coming back to me.
Yeah. Now. So I guess when such a key part of the plot doesn't work, it is always difficult.
I'll give them credit where credit's due. This is something that what's he called? It's Simon something. David Simon. Thank you. It's something that David Simon has always done well, which is throughout every season you see how decisions made in one system have knock-on effects in other systems. So something that happens to Carcetti could inadvertently have an impact in the schools. It could have an impact in the police force. It could have an impact on the streets. And I think, I've always liked that throughout the entire show, that the kind of knock-on effects that happen between all the different parts of the show. And I think it's the benefit that you get from trying to do something incredibly complicated, which is show the political angle, the dockyard angle, the police angle, the criminal angle, what the gangs are doing, trying to have all of those in the space of one TV show, and exploring them with complexity is bloody hard. And he does a really, really good job in showing how they all work together in some system. And I think that the way the newspaper outfit fits into season 5, even though it's a bit ridiculous at times with the Scott Templeton stuff, I remember it working quite well, and it doesn't upset that balance, I guess.
Yeah, there are sort of like quite fun links as well, like in the character of Gus, where you've got like a proper old school reporter. He almost knows a little bit of everyone in the city, so you kind of have a bit of stuff with Nerys and the ministers.
Who's Nerys?
She's like one of the senior politicians. You have some stuff with Norman. Norman, like Carcetti's number 2.
Is he the guy from House of Cards?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You have those characters are basically 2 like.
You like Norman. I remember you're a big fan of.
Like, there's a lot of sort of stuff with them. I think a thing it really tries to do this season is every season you're like almost going up the strata on like who you're going after, and then this is the season where they sort of indict Clay Davis, and there's all that political manoeuvring about getting Clay Davis, and then Clay Davis gives up that lawyer, doesn't he, the dodgy lawyer, right at the end of the show. And I think they're sort of making implications about like where the real power lies, and like where the real corruption is. I think that they kind of do that in an interesting way, but because everything's tied in with the serial killer stuff, it does all. Yeah,
it's hard. It is hard when everything feels like it stems from this one seed, which is the serial killer subplot, because it has so many impacts in so many other parts of the 5th season. Is season 5 the one where you have that? It's the Clay Davis court scene, the really, really great one where he stands up and he empties his pockets out.
Yeah, right? There are some funny moments.
Yeah,
that's the thing. It's like it's still got all of the characters it had before, so it is still fundamentally like a very entertaining and like well acted show. It's just some of the quality of the writing and like, the believability that goes. But I still like season 5 of The Wire. I watched a lot of YouTube clips, even like I watched a lot of the newspaper stuff just on YouTube clips. I was like really enjoying it. There's something about just watching a very reasonable person, like a person who you absolutely hate, come into conflict. Gus proves Scott wrong, which is very like satisfying.
Yeah. One thing I remember about season 5 really, really liking is what they do with Bubbles. That's the character's name, right?
Yeah, he sort of has his like full redemption, doesn't he?
Yeah, because I think this might be a season 3 and season 4 thing, but it's definitely season 4. He has probably his absolute lowest point in the entire show, and you don't think it's something that you could come back to.
It's a rough season for him.
It's an incredibly rough season. And in season 5, all the content that you get with him to do with his guilt over what happened in season 4 and how it's really had an effect on him, that really comes out, and I remember the acting being excellent. Like, he's really, really, really good.
Yeah.
He's the sort of... This is one thing The Wire also does really, really well. There are so many actors in this show where it feels like they just pulled them off of the street and said, "Can you be in this show?" Like they really feel like they get the environment completely. And Bubbles, it might be to do with the makeup, it might be to do with his direction, but his performance and just the way that he looks, it's so like I wouldn't be surprised if this person had, and I don't know this, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had no real acting experience before The Wire. But he fits that role like a glove, and there are a lot of performances just like that.
Definitely. I think we haven't talked about too much. I want to say it's incredible, but also I can't really remember it, so I can't really say that. I think that these Marlowe, Snoop, Chris, all of that like stuff with Prop Joe and everything there was as good as it was in season 4 and season 5. I think all of that content was pretty much on par, and it felt like a continuation in terms of quality and storyline. that being said, I can't really remember like the minutiae of like how all of that stuff like played out.
Yeah,
so I don't want to like talk about how great that is when, if I'm being completely honest. I remember how they get caught. And I remember that Marlowe's trying to get to the Greek, but I can't remember everything.
Do you remember that? Do you remember that scene where they're in jail and you actually see Marlowe act a little bit more explosively?
Yeah.
He says
Call me a punk.
Call me a punk.
It's great.
Yeah. I remember Chris and Snoop being better in season 4, but that might just be because I feel like there was more spotlight on them. I think it's also because I really liked their relationship with one of the young boys, Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember that being better in season 4. But you are right. I remember the Prop Joe stuff being good. I remember there being a really, really funny scene at the end of the film. Do you remember this? I told you before watching the 5th season that I caught the thumbnail of a video on YouTube, and it included Charles, and it included Method Man from the Wu-Tang Clan. I can't remember the... Cheese, thank you. Yeah, Cheese. It was either Charles kills Cheese or Cheese kills Charles or something like that. And I couldn't remember which way around it was, and I finally got the scene, and it's so funny because obviously Cheese gives up Prop Joe, doesn't he? And then he gets his comeuppance for it.
The classic YouTube clip is the Carcetti discovers the truth.
Yeah, that one's good.
And it starts with Aidan Gillen doing his shocked acting.
Yeah.
It's a great moment.
Yeah, that is a good one.
And then, like, I think the joke at the end of the show, right, is that the annoying Polish guy from season 2 becomes, like, the commissioner, right? Doesn't Rules get promoted? Rules gets promoted, and then that annoying...
It's like Stanischek.
Yeah, like Valchek.
Is it Val? Yeah, I think Valchek sounds right, yeah.
That he ends up getting, like, the promotion right at the end. Just basically, like, all of the white characters... like benefit from the liar, right?
Pretty much. What happens to the old police commissioner, the black guy who's the commissioner for most of the show?
Daniels.
No, not Daniels.
Oh,
I'm talking about.
I never remember his name.
It Rules is superior. I can't remember. Burrell. Yeah. Do you remember what happens with Burrell?
I don't.
Yeah, neither do I.
Right. Should we move on, or you got more Wire opinions?
No, I don't really have much more to say. I guess I'll just wrap up The Wire by saying that it's a brilliant show. I really, really loved most of it. I thought the 5th season was really, really disappointing because I thought that it abandoned something that made it so good in the first place and traded it for something that it really detracted me from the show, basically. But as Harry's mentioned, there was still some good pop. There was still some laughs along the way. I still had good fun, but like I said, it lost that critical edge to it that I thought was so great for the first 4 seasons.
Yeah. So Sopranos 6B is really good. It's 9 episodes.
Yeah.
8 of which are really great.
We know which one isn't.
Yeah. I feel like we pretty should have done this podcast like a year and a half ago when you watched it for the first time. I think I rewatched it with you the last few episodes of season 6. Yeah, excellent. I feel like I will have a lot to say, but because it's been so long, maybe not. But yeah, 6B starts with the episode Soprano Home Movies, which is the sort of the Bobby Bacala episode where him and Tony get in a fight because of Monopoly. Him falling out with Janice or whatever.
Yeah.
Then we've got Chicken Town, Remember When, Chasing It, Walk Like a Man, which is I think the one where Christopher dies. Actually, no, it's not. Kennedy and
Heidi's the one where Christopher dies.
Walk Like a Man's like Christopher's goodbye episode.
Yeah, Chasing It I think is the bad one.
Yeah. Kennedy and Heidi's the one where Christopher dies and then Tony goes to Las Vegas.
That's one of the best episodes.
Yeah. The Second Coming, The Blue Comet Made in America is the last final episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the 6th season of the show is the best season. And I don't think it's because it's necessarily the final season, because it's all heading to this amazing conclusion, which is the final episode of the show. I just think that I think that with earlier seasons of the show, the overall arcs of the stories are really, really good. But individual episodes, though they are good, you can kind of pass from one to the next, and it doesn't feel like the story has developed at quite the same rate, or it's not developed as interestingly as it could have done. But season 6, especially 6B, it feels like every episode it's almost its own standalone short film because it has its own story, it has its own, distinct identity. You mentioned Sopranos home movies, you mentioned Kennedy and Heidi, you mentioned, Made in America as the final episode. Like there's such memorable episodes, and the key points and plot points in each. I can just remember them. Unlike, say, for example, the 5th season of The Wire, where I remember overall stories and arcs, but I can't, pinpoint what happens in individual episodes.
I guess The Sopranos has always been a show that has very individual episodes. Like, every episode does almost stand alone. I think a big benefit of the final season, 6A&B, was that they knew what ending they were building towards. They did start being a bit bolder with allowing storylines to play out over a few episodes. But I think the big strength is, like I say, because the show is wrapping up, he really knew what he wanted to say by the end. And I think he puts everything in place to have like a very satisfying...
Chase, right?
Yeah, cohesive ending to the show. You get the Phil Leotardo, New Jersey, New York War that's sort of been building up for a few seasons. You have Tony and Christopher's relationship deterioration kind of culminating in Tony killing him. You have Melfi realizing... it happened, I think, in a very organic way. That
it does.
But it also happened in an organic way for the show writers. I think they just read more about like the sort of, people like Tony Soprano, like people with his acute personality disorders or whatever. People who were raised by a BPD mother who are kind of sociopathic, and how what the impact of therapy actually would be on them. It kind of draws a. It's a bleak season of TV because it does draw. You've been watching Tony for 6 years, for 6 seasons, trying to be a better person, and by the end, it ultimately decides, I think there's no hope for this guy. I think it's all lost, and then you potentially watch him die at the end.
I think Jennifer's realization, it's certainly done in a really, really good and interesting way, and I completely agree with the notion that Tony kind of it's sort of hard to really, I think, get to the bottom of what Tony's core principles and I guess mantras are, but I think he's certainly someone that uses therapy as an excuse to justify doing ongoing bad things. And throughout the show, I can think of several times where I think he's tried to be the better person. I think he's tried to make a morally upstanding choice in a world that doesn't really let him do that. When I think of all the violence that happens in season 5 with Blondetto, where it's not just, I think, Tony being a family member, but he has seriously hard choices that he's got to make as a leader of a mafia organisation. And I think sometimes his morals do get swept up in. He knows something that will make him feel better and could also be the right thing to do in this situation, but because ultimately his loyalty is to the mafia, it's to do with his, direct reports, all of that, he has to, make the choice that keeps the sanctity of that. And I think that overall throughout the show, you basically see a man that will never get better. He will never improve. He will always be who he is. And I think Jennifer realises that.
A key moment, I think, in the show, right towards the end, is when it's presented as a therapy session where Tony starts talking about how he's happy that Christopher's died. It's a relief and he's glad he killed them. And he starts talking about kill other people too, and talks about how, he killed Tony Blondetto. And then he wakes up and you realise it was a dream and he didn't actually say these things to Malfi. And he's like, I think he says to Carmela, was I talking in my sleep? He's almost in his dream unloading his guilt about, and his true feelings about how he's actually glad that Christopher's dead. Which are the things that you should say to your therapist. Of course he can't because of, the legality of it all. So there's almost no way of ever improving himself through therapy because he can't be honest, he can't say these things.
Yeah.
Even to himself, he struggles to admit it.
I think there are scenes though where he is brutally honest with Jennifer Melfi. It's just when he can't, incriminate himself. Yeah.
It's true. I guess there are absences.
Well, like when I think about the scene from season 5, I believe, where he talks about the impact that Blondetto going to prison for a long time had on him. That's a scene where he's allowed to be, honest.
But again, that starts with him just lying to her for ages.
Of course it does.
Yeah, and you've got the classic one where he's talking about how much he hates Vito for being gay, and then by the end of the scene he admits that he actually doesn't give a shit about that. He just likes that he earns him a lot of money. It's similar with his reaction to AJ, because AJ really struggles in the second half of season 6 with his depression, and I think he his father Tony hates AJ. I think he hates what he sees of himself in him. He hates that he's almost doing what his parents did to him to AJ. Obviously, there's other aspects to it in terms of like the environment they were raised in and class and everything. Like how have I coddled him? Have I spoiled him? Or I don't want him to do what I did. But like he talks about that, like that putrid soprano gene that he's got, that he sort of damned his son to this life. I do. We can talk more about AJ, but I do kind of like how the show ends with him. He's basically going to be little Carmine, isn't he? That is AJ's ending. That
he's got them into the movie industry. Yeah,
it's kind of strange. I would like to rewatch it because I feel like I can't talk too much about this from what I'm struggling to remember. But he like blows up a car, AJ, at the end.
It's his own car in the woods.
It's obviously tries to kill himself. There's a lot that happens to him.
It's very, very hard for him because I don't think for one moment ever in the show it suggests that AJ will ever take the same route as his father, but it presents an interesting idea around Tony, which is that, and I guess it's the same question that you ask anyone in any film or show that's ever about the mafia, which is that are you born into this life and are you forced to commit to it, or can you choose to do something different? And I think Tony probably feels like he's someone where he has a responsibility, whether he owes it to his dad or owes it to someone else, or there's some other deep-rooted ideas there. I think he's someone who very much thinks that this is his life and he has to commit to it, and he's committed to it since he was basically a kid.
Yeah, there's an inherent contradiction within, like, the Soprano household have to live with the fact that, the good things in their life are born from evil. And I think the question they will ask themselves is, can I be a good person in this? I think Meadow's interesting because Meadow starts as this kind of young, progressive, she goes to college, looking around the college as her dad killed someone, but we won't mention that bit. But yeah, she goes to college, she has like a black boyfriend, she's like working for like underprivileged, she wants to be a lawyer, she wants to she sees and calls out his racism, but then by the end of the show, she's marrying one of Tony's, she's basically marrying into the mafia, and wants to be a lawyer, and she talks about like anti-Italian discrimination and stuff. Like she's basically going to become part of the system, really. And she sort of drops that, she kind of grows into it. Yeah. AJ almost rubs up against it. He can never really get over that contradiction. I think that kind of destroys his soul in a sense. That he can't really, he tries to kill Junior, doesn't he, in 6A? But I think
it does beg that question that I mentioned a minute ago, which is, can you escape that life if you're born into it? If you have family, think of the character. You just mentioned Carmine Jr. a second ago. I mean, he's like a movie mogul or something, right? But he still uses the mafia as a means to an end in certain situations, and I think that either because they need it for I guess violent reasons, because they need something done and the best way to get it done is to use violence. Whatever the reason is, it is so. Yeah, it's that enigmatic question about morals and ethics in a world where you just get swept up in it and you get influenced by it. And even as you mentioned, Meadow, who starts off as a very generously motivated person, and that's not to say that she isn't by the end of the show, but she, as you said, she clearly makes some decisions that have an inevitability about them. You know where she's going.
Well, she's almost damned to become Carmela, isn't she?
Yeah.
In that's how she was raised. You ultimately are the children of your parents, and Carmela never. There's that incredible scene halfway through the show where Carmela gets faced with the choice. Someone tells her the truth about. She goes to see that lawyer, not lawyer, the shrink. You remember the scene?
Who are we talking about right now?
Carmela goes to see a psychologist or a therapist who just tells her the truth. He's like your husband. He's in the mafia. You need to leave him. Take the children.
I don't think it's a shrink. I don't think it's a shrink. It's a priest she goes to see, right?
No, I think he is a psychologist or therapist. Okay. But he basically, there's a moment halfway through the show where she just gets faced with the truth of what's actually going on with Tony. This you know, like, you need to escape from it, and then she just changes nothing.
Yeah.
She starts taking more money from the bird feeder to do her like housing project. I think she like knows that Adriana's been killed, but just can't accept it.
Yeah.
And I guess Meadow's the same. You know, Jackie Jr. got killed. She never really accepted how that happened. And I can't really remember Carmela stuff from this season, but you know.
There's a great episode, a really great episode she has. It's probably in 6A, annoyingly, so we can't really talk about it. It's the Paris one with
Rosalie April.
Yeah, Rosalie April. Yeah, that's a really, really good one.
Yeah, where you just sit back and appreciate the beauty.
Yeah, that's a really, really good one. Really good one.
I guess what you do have is the Sopranos always have the two threads of the family and the mafia, and it does start crashing in on itself when people start dying. Like when Tony's got to go home and tell them that Bobby's died, you know. And those moments where they suddenly all have to go into hiding together, and it does feel like the two stiff strands that were kind of separate, apart from small moments of crossover. The whole thing kind of comes crumbling down. I think that stuff's very effective. Obviously, it gives those last like 3 or 4 episodes like massive weight when main characters are dying, and it does feel that the stake, anything could happen.
And there's an open-endedness to the fate of some characters, like the Al Pacino guy. What's he called? Silvio Dante.
Yeah. That great scene where he gets shot.
Yeah, I just mean more that the last time you ever see him, he's in a coma, isn't he? You don't know. That's the open-endedness that I'm talking about.
Yeah, and then the big open-endedness is obviously the final scene of the show.
Yeah.
Should we talk about that now?
I'm just trying to think of some other little things, random bits I like.
I think we should talk about the final episode when we plan to end this podcast, because there's other stuff I want to talk about as well.
Yeah.
So first things first.
Chicken Town.
Yeah, okay, let's do Chicken Town. It's a great episode. It's what is that fucking guy's name? The guy who's in hospital with cancer who dies in that episode. The New York guy. What's he called?
Johnny Sack.
Johnny Sacramone. That's one of his best episodes. I love the whole Sydney Pollack stuff as well. I think that's really, really good. You obviously get to see some great content to do with the film that Michael has been making, and how it's basically just like an identical replica of his life, his relationship with Tony. Yeah,
Cleaver is incredibly fun. Like it's all of the stuff around it's so funny. But the fact that what it is it's Christopher's like, who's wanted to be a writer this whole time. His subconscious, like, creating this version of Tony and killing him in this film. And then Tony like seeing that and then not being able to get over that fact, I think is great. That stuff works really well.
Yeah.
Obviously, he kills JT Dolan. Do you remember JT Dolan has to go into the strip club and start talking about like, I actually based this relationship off this classic film. I find JT Dolan so funny because it's like seeing like a normal.
He's tragic. I don't think he's more tragic than funny.
But it's seeing like a normal person interacting in the world. He'll have like an interaction with Paulie Walnuts. Like you can see Paulie through JT's eyes. Like this guy is insane. And obviously Chris kills him for telling him the truth.
Yeah. Although I think that was more just Chris being totally drunk.
Yeah.
And not thinking rationally.
He's gone off the rails at that point.
Yeah, that episode's a low point for him.
JT
Dolan might be the unluckiest character in Soprano history, because anytime he's in an episode, it's always so he can be treated as a piece of shit, basically.
There's a great YouTube video called just like JT Dolan. It's just all his clips, like all the scenes he's in string together, and it is this tragic short film. A scene starts, he opens the door of his apartment, gets the shit beaten out of him. And next time you see him, the same thing happens. This is such a throwaway comment. But, do you remember how Christopher dies? Just before he does, he has the Departed soundtrack. I think what happened there is David Chase.
They're listening to Pink Floyd, I think.
I think he wanted to use that song.
Comfortably Numb.
Yeah, I think he wanted to use that song, and then The Departed did it as he was writing it. So he was like, I've got to lampshade this by having
so cool.
I have a feeling that's what happened there.
Yeah, that would be a great story if it's true.
But yeah, Chicken Town obviously ends with the Tony Christopher hug because that's become like the really tense relationship in the season.
It does. It actually brings me on to one of my critiques of the second half of this season, which is around the conflict between Tony and Phil Leotardo. And I think what makes my point... I think what makes my point is that final moment in Chicken Town, where you get this piece of music playing that's very, very tense. It's very, it's kind of boiling. There's something that's close to just basically some kind of explosion, something terrible happening. And I think the song really captures that well. And you have this really, really good moment where Phil is looking at the pictures of all the men that have come before him that have died, and he talks about how he's not going to take shit anymore. And then you get this really tense exchange between Tony and Chris. I think is it his son's christening or something like that. And that moment to me, because I knew about that scene from the start of the show, because it's a scene my dad watched on YouTube quite a few times when he was watching the show the first time around. And I wondered, why are you watching this scene over and over again? And then he told me, because it's a really, really good scene in the show. And my dad isn't the kind of person that really does stuff like that. So I thought, wow, this must really be quite an impactful moment in the show. My point is, I am getting to it. I don't really like the conflict between the two, because I don't think that it's done. I don't think there's enough war there. I don't think there's enough violence there. It basically becomes a game of hiding. I know there are people that die along the way, but you feel for like 2 seasons that this relationship between Tony and Phil, there's something about it that just doesn't quite gel. It's not going to work. And it's leading to that moment where they fall out beyond repair, and you're going to get an all-out war between New York and New Jersey. You do kind of get that. But it's like, first of all, the episode before Chicken Town, or maybe even afterwards, I can't quite remember, is that chasing it. And it feels like that episode about Tony's gambling issue just brings the pace of the whole season to a grinding halt. Because at that point you're going, oh wow, Phil and Tony are reaching their breaking point. Christopher's going to be critical because you've got this moment where Phil's talking about how he's done with Tony, and Tony's hugging Chris, and there's this kind of really, really haunting moment between them, and you're like, oh, Christopher's going to be an important part in the war. And I could almost write what was going to happen as it was happening and thinking this is going to be a great last 4 or 5 episodes. And they are great. But the fact that Christopher dies basically straight afterwards and then doesn't become an instrument for Phil to use against Tony, that's kind of where I thought they were going to. And it didn't do that. And I thought it was disappointing because it was kind of an open goal for me to make Chris important in that conflict between the two. And it just doesn't really happen.
Yeah, I think it's almost like a red herring in a sense, because I feel like they're setting stuff like that up, and they're setting up that it's one of those things that when the car crash happens, you understand why Tony's killing him, because he's like, actually, this is becoming a problem that I can fix now. If he had died, but he hasn't, so he's just got to do that. Although it is, it is like an act of evil, really, that Tony killing Chris. And definitely sets him on the path of like, this guy's long gone morally. He also has that great in that episode. He has that great moment where he sort of takes the peyote and comes to some realization about life in the universe and who he is when he's on the cliff. And he has the "I get it" moment.
That's one of my favourite moments in the show, because I don't know what it is that he gets. Maybe you have your own interpretation behind that, but I like the mystery behind what's this epiphany that he has out in Las Vegas with some woman that he just met yesterday.
I think it is a kind of acceptance of who he is. He doesn't have to pretend to give a shit about people like Chris. He can sort of be the most true version of himself.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know. I definitely would have a more strong interpretation if I'd seen it more recently. It's one of those great moments though, and then sets you into the really tense kind of final few episodes. Obviously, Phil, turns himself into a house at one point. That's a big plot point. He's got his before Chicken Town. He does this great speech about eating grilled cheese off the radiator.
Oh, that's a classic.
Compromise.
Yeah.
That's great. That's all great stuff.
We can talk. I'm happy to talk about the final episode now. I really wanted to talk mainly about Phil and Tony's conflict and my gripe with that.
A couple of other things. Like, I think Bobby's death scene's really good when he's in the train shop.
Yes.
And I think that they only give him that train like hobby because they're setting that scene up. It feels like that's like a really well shot, well done like death scene.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting how the Phil stuff wraps up. I think is kind of anticlimactic with like Butchie kind of turning, which kind of feels like it. There's like one scene where Butchie gets a phone call and then he like turns on Phil. I find that a little bit abrupt.
I personally, I see it. I get it because I think at that point there's something becoming a bit fractured between Phil and Butchie anyway.
Yeah.
Because Butchie gets this sense that the way this whole situation has been handled, it kind of reflects poorly on him and his ability to basically end a situation because he can't find Tony. Don't they end up killing some random guy and his Ukrainian girlfriend or something because they think it's Paulie or something like that?
No, I think it's that Tony puts a hit out on Phil and they kill the guy and he just looks like Phil.
Oh yeah.
And doesn't someone show in the newspaper like, who does this look like?
Okay, that
it's something.
Right.
It's something like that.
Right. So I'm wrong. That wasn't Butchie. That was more Tony. But still, I see that. I see that. I think Phil's death scene is quite good though. When it's at the petrol station, I quite like that one.
It's like something about it's very unsettling. Like the fact there's no music and then you have almost like the weird comedy moment of the cars slowly rolling over his head.
Oh god!
Yeah. And you have people like it feels like real people like reacting to it, like coming out the petrol station and like going like, oh shit.
Yeah.
You've got the Agent Harris stuff where he becomes like a spectator. He gives a bit of information to Tony, and then he has we're going to win this thing line.
I think that's more. I think all the Agent Harris stuff in that season is more for comic effects than because it's realistic.
Yeah.
I do not believe that a guy who has spent years chasing this guy and trying to nail him to a post would suddenly, at some point, kind of have a change of heart and go, you know what, I don't do that stuff anymore. So actually, I see myself in Tony a little bit, and I'm rooting for him to get out. So I don't buy that.
I think it's Sopranos because like it's a very big show with a lot of like huge themes. You know, you could say the whole show's it's about like American decline and like what it is to be like a man in like the 20th and 21st century. But like one of the things it's about like the mafia is dead and it's dead before season 1, episode 1. You know, like these guys are like the last guys doing this. Pretty much half the people they work with are all FBI informants. Like it's a joke how many of them are like ratting on each other. Like the whole thing's like dead to the point that obviously during the show, like 9/11 happens and it becomes about like the show starts to touch upon this, but the big threat, Agent Harris gets pulled off because it's about terrorism now.
Yeah,
like,
it's amazing how The Wire has that exact same thing, doesn't it? It must be. I know. Sorry to interrupt your point, but there's that great moment in that Adam Curtis documentary, Hypernormalization, where you see disaster movies before 9/11 and post 9/11. That's a great moment. Yeah, I mean, an event like that, 9/11, it basically just upsets the equilibrium, doesn't it? It just changes how things are done and made.
Someone made a short film about like the guys who were hired to, you know how in The Sopranos, Tony used to look in like his mirror in the car in the opening, and he used to see the Twin Towers.
Yeah.
Someone made a short film about the editors who had to remove the Twin Towers from that shot, like in the post 9/11 world. It's got a funny concept.
That's crazy.
But yeah, I think like obviously the show, and Agent Harris is a character, is pulled away from the mafia to focus on terrorism, and he's almost becoming an audience member. Like the mafia aren't really a thing now. Like they aren't to the same extent. They are a novelty. And I think I quite like that his reaction to that is I think it is quite realistic. If you ever read a story about the mafia now, like we do treat them as a novelty. Like we watch those YouTube videos, like Britain's most notorious gangster talks about his killings, like stuff like that.
Yeah. Have you ever seen that guy on YouTube he's an old gangster who talks about movies,
exactly.
like old mafia films?
That's what I mean. That is what the mafia is now. It's just guys being like, yeah, I used to do that. But like a big theme of The Sopranos is that Tony's generation were raised more by the Godfather than their own fathers. Like, their understanding, they don't. Paulie goes to Italy and he just is a complete outsider. Like, he's got no connection to it. They're fully Americanized now. They've lost that sense, the original root cause of it.
Isn't one of the opening lines of the show that Tony's talking to Jennifer in the opening scene? He says he feels like he's coming in at the end of something.
Yeah, that is it, and that's why it's so interesting that it kind of carries this through until the last episode, really. And obviously, the final scene is at the end of Tony's life. That's the question.
Yeah. Speaking before we get on to that final scene, before I watched the final episode, because I was watching the whole thing with my dad, basically, we really, really enjoyed it. My dad had already watched the show before and he loves it, so he was more than happy to watch it a second time. But I asked him if it would be okay for us to watch the opening episode. I've probably watched the opening episode about 7 or 8 times now. If we could watch the opening episode before watching the finale, just to get a feel of how much time has elapsed between episode 1 and episode, 88 or whatever. And you notice, obviously, some very, very clear things like the overall colour palette changes, the aesthetic changes. I know you're not a fan of the whole season 5 jump where the colour grading's a bit different and it looks kind of shit.
But like, thinking about it, the show does just get so much more bleak that I almost don't mind it. But,
and that's what I was going to come on to. Tony is depressed in the first episode of the show. He's clearly suffering from depression. He clearly needs help about it. But, I mean, his whole life, the people around him, just the whole atmosphere, it's so much more warm and happy and, I don't know, it sounds like a strange word to use, but elated than the final episode of the show. I mean, the final episode, from what I remember, starts off with him waking up, and he just looks like shit. And it doesn't help that the colour of the image is a lot greyer, it's a lot starker, but I just mean, he's the scene that you just had in the previous episode with the gun where he's on the bed, and it's just amazing. When you watch the first episode and the last episode back to back, you can just get the feel for how much time and misery has passed across that period. And it's encouraging to do that more with TV shows as well. I really like having that contrast that you can see pretty much in real time without having to basically sit through 6 seasons in between those episodes again. It was a really, really, really good idea on my part. So yeah, should we talk about the final scene?
Yeah. I mean, it was controversial at the time. I think it's
great nod to 2001. I like it.
I think it's probably the best thing about The Sopranos, if I'm being honest. I think is the decision to end it in the way they do. Obviously, the way, like you said, the 2001 jump cutting creates a very unsettling atmosphere. I think the weird thing about it is, because it's the final scene of the show, and the final episode's weird and it resolves the conflict within about the first 5 minutes of an hour-long episode. And then it sort of plays out as just like a normal family drama. And you kind of are looking at your clock the whole time. You're running out of time. You're like, where is this going? And then it ends with this very inconsequential scene. And then the abrupt cut. It was almost deliberately polarizing. And it exists to create confusion.
Yeah, I like that throughout the episode, you're right, the conflict gets wrapped up in the first 5 minutes. And then what you basically have is one last goodbye with pretty much what feels like every character. He goes to see, I think the penultimate scene is with Uncle Junior in the, I don't know if it's in a hospice or it's something like that.
Yeah, when he kind of, he's been completely abandoned. He's in like a sort of state psychiatric ward looking out the window at the city. And he tells, Tony goes in to berate him, realizes Junior's, got nothing left. He doesn't even know, who he is or anything. And he tells him, you used to run the city. And he just goes, that's nice. And that's how again, very depressing, but that's how the character, they end that whole thing.
You get the final scene with Janice. It just feels like a really good, sending off with every character. You get to see them one last time before that final scene.
But there's almost like no real mob conflict. Like all the conflicts in the final episode is what AJ is going to do with his blows up a car and it's like, what job's he going to do? What internship? It becomes very much like these are now the stakes of the finale of the episode.
Yeah, and you know that if Tony didn't die at the end of the show, then there would always be more things that would crop up. I mean, we wouldn't know how much time Tony has left anyway because of the enemies that he's made throughout the show.
Yeah.
There's that great line about, I can't remember the specifics of it, but it's to do with how if you're in the mafia, the only two outcomes you get is you get shot and you die, or you get imprisoned for the rest of your life.
Yeah. And I think, like, obviously, the show has an ambiguous ending where there's a cut and you don't know what happens post-cut. And the point of ambiguous endings is always the ambiguity, the fact that the creator didn't make a choice, it was leaving up to the audience and you have to interpret it, you know. But it's all, I think it, despite that fact, it's always fun to, like, theorize and, you know, I think you have to accept that the ambiguity is ultimately the point. Like, the point of the ending of The Sopranos is that you don't know what happens to Tony. That you're cut off from that moment. And you and him are always going to speculate about what's coming next. Did he get killed? Is he going to spend the whole rest of his life looking over his shoulder and, like, you know, worrying about it? That being said, I think he does get killed. Kind of taking away from the actual point of it with the ambiguity. I do pretty definitively think that what we are seeing is the death of Tony Soprano, in that either we as the audience are being cut off from him and we can't see him anymore, or a guy's come out of the bathroom with a gun and has shot him in the head, which is probably what actually happened.
Yeah, you are right in that it probably is maybe that's not the best thing in the show by quality. It's certainly the greatest thing about the show.
It gives me goosebumps to think about. Like,
it does me too. It's probably the most analysed scene in the entire show. It's the scene that gets talked about the most. It's the scene that's in popular culture the most. It's certainly when you talk to people about The Sopranos, and if their minds aren't immediately jumping to just, you know, buzzwords like mafia, crime, psychiatry, if they were thinking about a specific scene, they'd be thinking the finale of the show. Even if they haven't watched it, I'm sure that a lot of people that know anything about TV will know how it ends. And I think I agree with you as well. I think he probably does die. And if it isn't in that scene, then it's you know, sooner or later. He's made so many enemies throughout the show. And that scene really does encapsulate, I think probably better than any other scene in the show, just how you have to live with a paranoia, being the kind of person that he does. As you said, you're always looking over your shoulder. Any person that comes walking through that door, you finally... I don't feel like you get this very much in the show, but in that one scene, you do see things through Tony's eyes. Anyone that comes through that door is a threat. There's a possibility there.
The way it's been constructed and edited, it's kind of like this reverse shot where you're seeing Tony in, like, from, like, an objective viewpoint. You'll hear something and then you'll get a close up on him and then you'll see through his eyes, like, who's coming through the door, what's happening. And that's kind of why it's like whether the cut to black is him, like, not being able to see anything. I find it interesting, the interpretation that it is very much like, it's like the audience, like, David Chase thought the audience want to see Tony get killed or want to see him, you know, get arrested, and it's him not giving you the satisfaction by just cutting you off at that moment that you don't see anymore. And I do quite like that interpretation. But also, there's something about the whole, like, the framing of the shot, reverse shot, of him looking up, hearing a bell for Meadow coming in, which distracts him from the guy, this very suspicious-looking guy who's probably going to kill him. I think how the scene's been constructed is just genius in the sense that, because it is so throwaway and so little is happening, you know the stakes of this is the final episode of one of the greatest television shows of all time, so you're hyper-focused on those details. And the way that the music's used, you know, Don't Stop Believing is such a great choice. And it just keeps, like, the noise of it just keeps building as, like, nothing's happening. You're like, it's getting more tense because of that. And then they're hyper-focusing on Meadows' parallel parking.
Parallel parking is already one of the scariest things that people have to do
it's
in their life.
So weird about, like, you know something's going to happen, but nothing does. And I think that tension and that abrupt cut, I don't know, I think it's one of the best depictions of death I've seen. It's terrifying the way it just cuts to black. Yeah, suddenly, like, it builds in such a way and then doesn't climax. And I think that's what, like, when I think back on it, like, it gives me goosebumps just to sort of relive that moment in my head.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I watched the scene so many times afterwards, again and again, to kind of make up my mind for what I think the scene is telling me. And it is certainly one of the greatest depictions of death, if it is about death, both in a literal sense or a metaphorical sense, as you mentioned, as well, because it's such a unique portrayal of it as well.
Yeah.
It's like mainly with that cut to black right at the very end.
Yeah, it's a first person portrayal of death.
And I also really like the fact that Don't Stop Believing is the song that gets used, probably because there's a thematic reason, but also because it wasn't a song I really liked. It's like, there are a lot of 80s songs out there that, for me, I associate with being the bad side of 80s music, which is cheesy, overly sentimental, just trash like that. And that was a song that it had been overheard, overused. But I really like that song now. Every time that I listen to it, I think of The Sopranos, and it makes me really sad because I can only watch that show for the first time again, and it is one of my favourite shows. So, having an emotional connection between a song and a TV show that you love, it really does sort of, it's kind of uplifting in a sense, but it also makes you emotional. And that song as well, there is something about it that's quite, I don't know, like profound, for lack of a better word. Like, it's a profound piece of music in a sense, isn't it?
I think it was very much a song that David Chase liked a lot, and then had become like a joke, a bit of a joke, that people looked down on it. He didn't really get that, so I think that's kind of why he wanted to use it. Yeah, I think it is. I think, obviously, in the context of the final episode and like the final scene of the show, I'm always going to view the song through that lens now. But the way it's used, the abrupt cut mid-lyric as well.
Don't stop.
Yeah. With the cut to black, it's just it's such. I'm always going to think about it, basically, and it is such an evocative final moment to end the show on. It's almost a shame. It's almost a shame that the credits do have to come in about 10 seconds later, because for legal reasons they have to actually credit people.
Yeah.
Like the joke was that people thought their like TV sets had like turned off. Back in like 2007, that people were calling up HBO and like complaining because they didn't know what the fuck had happened. It's great.
That is great.
Like The Sopranos, I'll always remember for like I can think about it intellectually and be like, oh, it's a great show with a lot of really like important stuff to say and like really compelling characters and great plot lines. And then like as I'm more divorced from it, I can be like, actually, it's really funny. But the thing that lingers with me, that is such a small aspect of the show, but is the most profound, is like these like really weird, surreal aspects of it. Because it's a show about the subconscious and psychology, and it uses dreams a lot. But then Paulie just sees like a ghost. There's a moment where he sees the Virgin Mary. When he goes, all the weird stuff about like 4 o'clock, and like there's just these like weird, like ghostly, haunted aspects to the show that like are very like subtle and small, but like they do really like linger with me. It is very Lynchian, the whole thing, and like it does feel like Twin Peaks: The Return could have had the Sopranos ending.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, actually. When I think back to some of my favourite moments in the show, I think about scenes from Tess' dream, because I think that dreams are quite important to us in the sense that they have a bizarre logic to them, and when you wake up, you can only half remember them. And if you as you wake up, you have an imprint of what you've just seen, but then if you wait a minute, you've forgotten all those details.
Yeah.
They're such strange things. And I think the show is really, really fascinated about that. And it's really fascinated about like the illogic to them. I think back to that, one of my favourite scenes in the whole show is that one where he's in his coma, so it's kind of a dream and kind of not, but he's outside that house and he's got that suitcase with him. And
he doesn't want to go in.
And he doesn't want to go in. And you can't like... You can't reasonably or logically explain what it is about him that makes him desperately not want to go through that door. And you can kind of imagine, you can kind of see what it is. If he goes through that door, he dies, right? That's like him letting go of everything completely, and that's what the suitcase represents. But just to see that on screen, and he's in a physical environment. He's outside. There's a house. It's all physical. It's all literal. But knowing that it's a dream and knowing that there's something about it that is like innately bizarre and not quite right is, I think, the thing about them that will, as you say, linger with you, because they're so peculiar, aren't they, those scenes?
There's the other one that's linked to that is really terrifying, It's the one where he's got the stupid Italian accent, but where he's in the suspenders, and it's a similar thing where it's clearly he sees a house and doesn't want to go in, and he sees that like figure on the stairs of like a woman with no face, like in Shallow, who I think is probably like his mum's died, and that's like probably who that is, and that house probably represents like what's waiting for him when he dies. And it's also this like terrifying, because she is really the thing that destroyed him, like his horrible mother, and she kind of looms over him his entire life, and like just that like ghostly figure of that like faceless woman. And I think in that episode, I think he was in Miami, so he wakes up and goes outside, and that's how that episode ends. But yeah, it's those moments that really linger with me, about the Sopranos. Those really kind of like poignant and like terrifying and like deep moments that like we can have alongside watching Chris talking about Cleaver and saying, but maybe it's supernatural.
and that final scene, though it's not a dream, it is still surreal in a way. That whole 2001 thing, cuts to black. That
is very unsettling. Like even in 2001, the whole like you're looking through the character's eyes and suddenly they're there. It's
weird.
Like you don't choose to do that. If you're making safe decisions at the end of like your award-winning HBO's TV series, you don't be like the final scenes could be an homage to 2001 with "Don't Stop Believing" playing ridiculously loud, like they crank it up.
It's blaring,
so loud at the end.
It's blaring for sure. Anyway, so I guess if we are going to wrap it up, I do really like what you've just said about the surrealness of the show. Is what sticks with you because of how intriguing it is, how mysterious it is, how it can play on your mind a little bit. I think that's one of my favourite things about the show. I think, though, what it ultimately comes down to is just that central performance. I think back to one scene that I've watched on YouTube quite a few times, which is, I think, him going to that guy that runs the Esplanade or something like that. And it's just Tony in a car. And in the space of about 15-20 seconds, he goes from being miserable to like laughing through choked tears and grinning, and it's just in the space of 20 seconds this guy goes on a real roller coaster of emotions, and the way you can tell the things that are on his mind. I know this is kind of the essence of acting, but the way you can tell what's on his mind, the things that he's thinking, and the way that he actually brings that out physically throughout the entire show. There's that great line in the Nerdwriter video on the psychiatrist scene where he says at the very end, great actors don't always get, the gift of great writing, but when you do, you got to take the opportunity. And I think with this show, it's like a marriage made in heaven. It's a really well-written show. It's got tons of nuance and subtlety, as we said. It's also mainstream and accessible enough that anyone could get into. It's not artsy, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it has that incredible central performance that is just that's the thing that you latch onto, in my opinion, the most.
I think like all great pieces of pop culture, it's something that you can enjoy on like multiple levels. You can switch your brain off and watch Sopranos compilations of like the funny moments, and then also, it's got a lot to say. And I think when we really get down to it, looking at the Sopranos from a holistic point of view, if I was to like summarize what the theme of the entire show is,